Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And in this one we have two Russian armored assaults, a Ukrainian counterattack by Bakhmut, and some infantry assaults north of Avdiivka. So we start out with the first armored assault by the Russians, which took place north of Pryotne here in the Zaporizhia-Donetsk border. And in this we see that the Russians launched multiple armored vehicles towards this forest line and forest patch and have captured parts of it, leaving the rest of it in the gray zone as fighting continues in the northern parts. So this armored assault was focused around moving forward and clearing the way as they assault Ukrainian positions here to the north of Pryotne. We see in this footage here numerous Russian armored tanks and other infantry fighting vehicles which likely are transporting troops to take control over the area after the fighting. So we're seeing that there's a lot of shelling and a lot of fighting taking place as these tanks move through the front line to the end of the forest line and they shoot at Ukrainian positions in those forest lines. So there is a lot of fighting taking place in this footage and it walks quite a bit. And we see some infantry dismounting at the end of the forest line, which shows that my assessment was correct. The Russians are launching this armored assault to try and capture this territory where they cover fire for an infantry assault group to reach the forest line as they shoot at Ukrainian positions, and then the infantry move on to try and get a foothold here in the forest lines, after which fighting continued with the infantry taking the lead and the armored vehicles returning back to base. What this really shows is that the Russians are here initiating a new offensive operation by Pryotne, and this again is a casual response by the Russians. What they typically do is they wait around for the Ukrainian counterattack and then they launch their own attack elsewhere to keep the Ukrainian elite active defense forces on the run, moving around, whether it be to the Zaporizhia front, Novomikhailivka up north, down to the Bakhmut direction, and so on, constantly keeping them on the move so they do not have time to rest. This Ukrainian force is, of course, not just one. There is a lot, and they are spread across the front line. The real question is how much, and the Russians are likely doing these attacks, possibly even just probing attacks, just to figure out just how many the Ukrainians have available. If they see the same units multiple times at the same part of the front line, they can guess where its operational position is, how far is it willing to go, and when does it go into another force's territory, and so on. So there's a lot of information to gain from launching these probing attacks across the front, and Pryotne is far from any of the other areas that they've launched attacks throughout this winter, which shows that it is likely the area where they are trying to see just how long will it take for the Ukrainians to respond to fighting here in this section. Maybe they can start launching attacks here by Oroshaina, where we saw a small attack. However, this was caught very quickly, and the Ukrainians counterattacked and retook the position within 1 day, which shows again that the Ukrainians do have different sets of forces in different positions, and likely to had one close by Oroshaina to just respond quickly. And now we're seeing fighting by Pryotne. And here we'll see how long it takes for the Ukrainians to respond and if the Russians will develop it further. We then move on to the second armored assault, which is here to the southwest of Novomikhailivka. So we saw the Russians make some advancements here in the early days of January, and then we saw the Ukrainians counterattack and recapture positions 2 weeks later. So there was a very long response time to that. But then we saw now that the Russians have started another armored assault here in this position, and the fighting that took place here was massive. It was a huge fight, and the Russians took a lot of armored casualties in this fight, but they managed to capture important Ukrainian fortifications here to the west of Novomikhailivka. Likely the initial advancements were met with little to no resistance, as Russians were trying to detect the Ukrainian defensive positions, and then once they reached the forest lines and the Ukrainian defensive positions, that is when the Ukrainians launched their counterattack. And then with the defensive position reached, the Russians now knew where it was and launched this assault specifically to capture that fortified position. The fortified position was located here in the forest lines, where it was in a T position, where the back side was protecting the flanks and the front side was protecting against a direct assault, and that's exactly what we saw took place. This duplicated footage here shows where the Russian assault was taking place and exactly how the fighting took place. So we know that the Ukrainian defenses is formed like a T in this part, and then we see footage of the Russian vehicles that fought against it here to the south. So the Russians launched an assault by the forest line. They were moving by the forest line and then moved upwards towards the fortifications from the south. This is to avoid facing as much of the fortification as possible, because at this point the back line will not be able to detect them, as their visibility would be limited to the southern parts and the northern parts, while the visibility here would go in this direction. So at some points they would lose view of exactly where the Russians are from every single position throughout the trench. A direct assault would allow the Ukrainians to see every single one without any problems from all parts of the trench, while the assaults from the south limited the Ukrainian visibility of the Russian assault. So we see that the Russians launched these assaults here by the forest line and then moved in a northwards direction and started storming the forest line. And from this geolocated footage of the aftermath, satellite imagery, we see exactly how much shelling took place during this assault. The Ukrainian positions were completely demolished, and from this, the Ukrainian fortifications and defensive positions here were destroyed, and the Russians took control over the area despite encountering all of these armored losses from the fighting. The way that worked was the Russians launched these assaults towards the Ukrainian positions, which revealed their positions, and the Russian artillery then heavily bombarded everywhere they were to bits and pieces. We then move further north in the direction of the northern flank of Avdiivka, where we have this footage of Stepove from Deep State Map, which was geolocated to be in the northeastern parts. And in this footage, we see that Russian soldiers are moving through the snow to get to Stepove. We're seeing them moving a decent point of distance between each other, and they're moving through whatever's left of the forest line, trying to move towards the Stepove direction. This is likely to occupy some of the houses within the village and solidify the control over the area. As soon as artillery hits nearby them, they drop to the floor and take cover, trying to avoid further artillery shells hitting their positions, knowing that they have been detected. So based on this footage, we see that there are attempts by the Russians to move closer up to Stepove, and the Ukrainians are constantly shelling them with cluster munitions and other shells to try and prevent them from occupying the buildings within Stepove and solidifying their control over the area and advancing further. We then move further north to the Bakhmut direction, where there has been reports that the Ukrainians have managed to make some recapture some territory here in Bohdanivka and to the south of the village. The Ukrainians are here trying to push back and recapture some territory to prevent the Russians from capturing, most importantly, Bohdanivka, but also to prevent them from getting closer to Ivanivske from the north. They have their fortified positions by the forest patches and forest lines here to the north of Ivanivske, southeast of Bohdanivka, and with this continuous fighting takes place, the Russians have lost their foothold within the forest patches here with the recent Ukrainian counterattack, and fighting also continues by the cemetery. So with this, there is constant efforts by the Ukrainians to push back the Russians and prevent them from getting important areas from Ukrainian hands, and this is likely to prevent any of the Russian forces from storming through Bohdanivka, which would allow them to reach the canal line. So there is this constant fighting taking place here in the north, despite this being the first territorial changes in the northern flank of Bakhmut in January, and this just shows how heavy the fighting is with how little advancements there are taking place. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.